Ever feel like the tech world is moving at a million miles a minute? I mean, how are we supposed to keep up with all the new gadgets and apps and everything else? That's kind of what we're looking at today.
It's true. It never stops, does it?
Nope, not for a second. So we just dug into this really interesting podcast episode from Tech Horizons. They were talking about something that's totally changing how everything from the apps on your phone to these big online platforms, how they're built.
Yes, software architecture, definitely not the first thing you think about, but when you get down to it, it's the foundation for all the cool tech we use every day.
And get this, they were saying that companies are having to basically rebuild their software, like completely overhauling it.
Yeah, and it's not just about using the newest, shiniest tech, though. Like, it's not just keeping up with the Joneses. It's more like, imagine if cities were still trying to run on systems from, like, the 1970s.
Oh, gosh.
Things would fall apart.
Yeah.
So companies are realizing that their software needs a serious upgrade just to keep up with how we use technology today.
Yeah, it's like trying to run a marathon with, I don't know, with one shoe. You're not going to get very far.
Right. Exactly.
So these older systems are called legacy systems, which I guess sounds a little bit nicer than calling them a developer's worst nightmare.
A little bit, yeah. It's basically what we're talking about.
So no more duct tape and prayers when it comes to writing code these days. So what is it? What's the big solution?
So the podcast talked about this thing called multi-tier architecture. And it's kind of like, imagine you're organizing a really messy room.
I was just thinking about that with what you were just saying.
Perfect. So you've got clothes in one spot, books in another. It's about bringing some order, right?
Right.
But then came the real breakthrough. Microservices.
Okay.
So instead of having one giant machine trying to do everything, picture a team of specialists, each handling one specific task really, really well.
Okay, so less like a one-man band and more like, what, a symphony orchestra.
Exactly. Like a symphony, each section has its own instruments, its own parts, and they all come together to create this amazing, complex sound.
I like that.
Right. And now think about something like an e-commerce site. With microservices, you could have separate teams dedicated to just payments, just inventory, just recommendations, each one working independently.
Oh, that's interesting.
And this is what allows companies to be so agile. You can update one feature without impacting the entire system, meaning less downtime for users, faster releases of new stuff, fewer glitches.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But how do you make sure all those different parts are communicating with each other? Because it's code, right?
Yes, and that's where it gets really cool. This is where they're using something called Polyglot programming, which is essentially different programming languages working together.
Wow.
So imagine a music streaming service. You could have Python powering the recommendation algorithms because it's really good with data, while Java, which is known for its reliability, might be handling your payment processing in the background.
Huh. So instead of forcing one language to be a jack of all trades, each part uses the absolute best tool for the job.
Exactly.
Wow, that's really cool.
It's like assembling a dream team of coding languages,
Yeah.
each with its own specialty.
I like it. This is actually reminding me of that time I tried to put together this. It was like a bookshelf by myself.
Oh, yeah.
Total disaster. So yeah, having like a dedicated team for each part just makes so much more sense.
It does. It really does. And it kind of ties into another big shift that the podcast talked about, and that's this whole idea of separating the front end and the back end. Think of it like a restaurant, okay? So you have the front end. That's like what you see, right? The menu, the ambiance, that stylish waiter who takes your order.
Right.
But then you have the back end. So that's the kitchen, the chefs, this whole intricate system for actually getting the food prepped and onto your plate.
Yeah, okay, I see where you're going with this. So we interact with the front end, but the back end is where all the real work is happening behind the scenes.
Exactly. And just like a restaurant might have specialized chefs for different dishes, right? Software development has specialized technologies for the front end and the back end.
Oh, that's interesting.
So on the front end, you've got your React, Vue.js, Angular. These are all the things that create those really sleek user interfaces that we love on websites and in apps. And then on the back end, you've got languages like Java, Node.js, Go. These are the engines under the hood that are handling data, logic, all that complex stuff we don't see.
So this separation, it lets the developers really zero in on their zone of genius.
Yeah.
So to speak.
Exactly.
Which I'm assuming means that we get a much better experience as users.
Exactly. Better products, faster updates, fewer bugs.
Speaking of which, the podcast gave a really cool real-world example of this in action, right?
Yeah, they did. The Netflix example, that one really stood out to me. So think about how often Netflix is updating their recommendation engine, right?
All the time.
Constantly, right. Because it has to evolve based on your viewing habits, what's trending, all of that. But we, as users, we never see any downtime. There are no glitches during these updates.
It is pretty incredible when you think about it. It's like they're renovating the entire restaurant while it's still open for business, and nobody even notices.
I like that. That's a good one.
They also talked about how startups are using this approach to their advantage, too.
For sure, and they have to, right? Startups need to be super nimble and able to adapt and grow really quickly. And these modern architectures that we're talking about with their independent, modular parts, they give startups that flexibility so they can scale their resources up or down as needed. They can respond to user feedback in real time. They can constantly innovate without having to rebuild everything from the ground up every single time.
So it's a totally different game from those, like you said, those clunky legacy systems.
Oh, yeah. Night and day.
This is amazing, though, like how it all comes together to create this experience for the user where you don't even notice all the stuff that's happening. But I imagine there's a lot going on in the background to make it all work so smoothly.
Oh, yeah. For sure.
The podcast, I think, mentioned this thing, DevOps.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the cloud. Those are I have a feeling those are big parts of this recipe for modern software.
Absolutely. And you can almost think of DevOps as like the invisible force, right? It's this kind of behind the scenes thing that's keeping everything running smoothly.
Okay.
It's about breaking down the walls between the developers who are writing the code and the operations teams who are responsible for actually keeping it up and running.
Right.
And, in the past, these teams often worked in silos, which could lead to all sorts of delays and miscommunications and, things breaking.
So it's like that direct line between, okay, going back to our restaurant analogy, between the kitchen and the dining room, right? The chefs can get instant feedback on what people are saying about the dishes, and the waiters know exactly what's cooking and when it's going to be ready.
Yes, exactly. And that collaboration is absolutely essential, right? Especially in such a fast-paced world like technology.
Right.
And then the cloud, well, the cloud's like having a global network of these kitchens at your disposal that you can tap into at a moment's notice. So instead of companies having to invest in tons of their own physical servers, they can basically just use these vast resources on demand.
So it's like magic. But instead of pulling a rabbit out of the hat, they're pulling terabytes of data from the cloud.
Exactly.
Okay, so it all sounds incredibly efficient, but are there any downsides? The podcast mentioned a couple of the challenges.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it would be great if it was all, sunshine and roses.
Right.
But it's not. And I think one of the biggest hurdles, honestly, is the expertise gap. Building and managing these types of sophisticated systems, these architectures, requires a really specific skill set. And, there's a lot of companies that are really scrambling to find these developers, these architects who can think in terms of microservices and cloud platforms and these automated processes.
So this is a pretty valuable skill set for anyone who is interested in tech to have, I would think. It's not just about coding anymore. It's about understanding this entire ecosystem of these connected systems.
Yeah, it's like the difference between knowing how to drive a car versus actually understanding how to design and build one from the ground up.
Right.
It's a whole different level. And then the podcast also touched on this idea. I thought it was really interesting, the whole orchestration part.
Orchestration.
Orchestration. So remember we were talking about, with our e-commerce example, those independent teams working on different parts of the website.
Yeah.
So orchestration is the art of coordinating all of those moving parts.
Okay.
Making sure that they're all working together in harmony.
Okay, so it's like having the conductor who can keep the orchestra in sync even when everyone's playing their own separate parts.
Yes, that's a great analogy. And just like a conductor needs to know the strengths and weaknesses of each instrument, these orchestration tools, they need to manage all these complexities of different programming languages and databases and cloud environments.
Wow. So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive from these kind of, I don't know the word, monolithic legacy systems all the way to this agility and flexibility of microservices. So it seems like software architecture is going through this massive transformation.
It really is, yeah. It's a super exciting time to be involved in tech because things are changing so rapidly.
Yeah. But this evolution, this isn't the end, right? The podcast kind of hinted that there's even more mind-blowing things on the horizon.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, they talked about serverless computing and event-driven architecture and all. That's just the tip of the iceberg.
So serverless computing, just so I'm clear on that, that's where companies can basically build and deploy applications without even having to worry about the infrastructure.
It's getting close to that, yeah, essentially.
Wow.
It's pretty wild.
And then event-driven architecture, Does that take that responsiveness to like a whole new level?
Exactly. So instead of systems constantly checking for updates, they can just react to events as they happen in real time.
It sounds like we're on the cusp of a software revolution. But I think the biggest takeaway for me is that it's all about, at the end of the day, it's about us, the users,
Right.
creating these better, faster, more efficient experiences. And I can't wait to see what amazing innovations are just around the corner.
Me neither. It's definitely a great time to be following all this stuff and seeing how it plays out.
So what do you think? What industry or product do you think will be most impacted by these changes in, they'll say, the next few years? Head over to our social media, let us know your predictions. We'd love to hear from you. And until next time, happy deep diving.